So I want to say a little bit about intellectual and cultural trends in France in the early years of the Fourth Republic after the war. What sometimes are known as, let me just bring my mouse back over here, what sometimes are known as Sartre years. Basically, sorry, there we go. What are sometimes known as the Sartre years. So we already came across Jean-Paul Sartre in an earlier video section of this lecture. He was the one who published Being and Nothingness in 1945. He was one of the leading French intellectual lights in the wake of the Second World War. Excuse me. Here he's pictured with Simone de Beauvoir, his longtime life companion, not married because they didn't believe in marriage, but herself actually a quite prominent French intellectual who I'll circle back to in a second. So we'll start with Sartre. He was kind of spent much of his time trying to figure out, well, what's the role of a philosopher? What good is a philosopher to society? And what exactly should a philosopher be doing in order to make life better? I'm going to jump back I'm just going to edit this. One of the first intellectual challenges for France after the First World War or Second World War was what to do about those French intellectuals, and there had been some who had collaborated with the Nazis as well. So unlike Sartre and others, who Marc Bloch being the most famous example, who was actually killed for fighting with the resistance, and what to do with those who had collaborated with the Nazis. One of the most famous examples, most notorious examples, was Robert Brasillach, who had been an editor of a newspaper, Je suis partout, I am everywhere, which had actually been established in the 1930s. And had always been a right-wing newspaper, but had kind of shamelessly collaborated with the Germans once the Nazi occupation began. And under Brasillach, it had engaged in very, very anti-Semitic language. It had called for the murder of Jews. It had called for the murder of members of the Third Republic government, and had essentially advocated not just full collaboration with the Nazi government, but a very violent call to defeat or to murder the enemies of what Brasillach conceived to be the enemies of the French state. After the war, Brasillach was put on trial for treason and convicted and sentenced to death. And this caused a great storm amongst French intellectuals. Many of them felt, even if they felt Brasillach was completely wrong, that they had a moral dilemma about whether someone should be executed, essentially for what they wrote in the newspaper. Brasillach himself was not responsible directly for any of the actions taken against Jews or other people in France. In terms of he didn't physically get involved in those actions. Obviously, it encouraged anti-Semitic attacks, and so some people wondered whether it was morally right or wrong to execute someone for their ideas, basically. So it's a whole swath of French intellectuals, many of them who diametrically opposed to Brasillach's ideas, including Albert Camus, signed a letter asking the French government not to execute him, but he was indeed executed, and other notable French writers who had participated or collaborated with Nazis, many of them actually committed suicide as well. So in some ways the French intellectual climate was cleansed of those who had played a very active role in working with the Nazis during the Nazi occupation. There was also a new French newspaper. Let me ask you the question if you're familiar with what the newspaper is. So this worldly French newspaper was established at the request of Charles de Gaulle in 1944, and the answer is, what is Le Monde? So Le Monde was established by de Gaulle. He basically recognized the value of we need a new newspaper to engage in honest political reporting, that much of the previous French press was discredited. And so Le Monde quickly became a very, very popular newspaper. To this day, it's probably the second most widely read newspaper in France, following behind Le Figaro, which had existed for much longer. and brought a new kind of energy and emphasis to media and the relationship between the media and the wider public after the Second World War. So I mentioned the two main philosophers, or at least the leading light of the French intellectual society was Jean-Paul Sartre, pictured here. I've begun mentioning that he was very interested in what is the role of a philosopher in society. And that brings us to our next Jeopardy question. So this philosophy, popularized by Sartre, although not invented by him, stresses that each individual is responsible for giving meaning to their own life. And the answer is, what is existentialism? And essentially what Sartre was saying is that it was up to people themselves to kind of make meaning in their own life, that it was possible, essentially a promotion of free will, that people could shape and change and make things better. So he kind of rejected these arguments of the kind of helplessness of human beings in the face of greater world trends. He very much believed that it was possible for human beings to take an active role in their world and make things better. His most famous work was, which I mentioned earlier on, but let's have a look at the game. So, Being and Nothingness, published in 1943. Although it was actually more his plays and his other kind of publications where Sartre kind of more fully fleshed out what exactly he envisioned by existentialism. And for Sartre, he was also a committed Marxist, and so he spent much of his time trying to take Marxist idealism and kind of the theory of Marxism and trying to boil it down to practical steps that could be taken to improve the lives of ordinary people. So he very much believed in philosophers being hands-on, that philosophers could, and not just philosophers, anyone, but philosophers, intellectuals as well, could shape the world they lived in and could make things better and should be involved in politics and trying to reshape society actively. So that was very much Sartre's understanding of existentialism as he was trying to encourage it. He won a wide following. Not exclusively, there were some people, perhaps the most obvious person who we kind of Sartre fell out with was Albert Camus. That Camus, over time, became skeptical about any kind of ideology or idea that offered kind of solutions to solving all of life's problems. That we might see Camus in that sense as a kind of postmodernist kind of skepticism that philosophers could, or well, essentially to sum up Camus more succinctly, that Marxism has just as much a tendency to result in totalitarianism as fascism did. So unlike Sartre, who saw the ideas of the left as being the salvation for humanity and the ideas of right being their enslavement, Camus became much more skeptical about whether the left and communism or socialism really were all that different from totalitarianist fascism, and whether they would not end up doing something very, very similar. Intellectuals like Sartre were also deeply concerned by the rise and influence of American culture in France after the Second World War. Sartre considered the United States to be overly materialistic and a bad influence, basically, on France, and trying to discourage French people from kind of falling into the trap of American materialism. In the early 1950s, Coca-Cola had tried to officially launch itself as a product in France. Coke had been available in France going back to the 1930s, although albeit not, it wasn't made in France, it wasn't really advertised, it was kind of more sold on the kind of periphery of the market. But when it tried to capture a share of the French market in the 1950s, it was resisted by a few different groups. I mean, people like Sartre, who rejected it for its kind of overt connections with Americanism and American soft imperialism, communists who rejected the kind of free market, anti-union working model of the Coca-Cola company, and then, of course, French winemakers who were very concerned that if soft drinks caught on in France, that would hinder the French wine industry as well. So Coca-Cola established in France in the early 1950s, but not without considerable opposition from a variety of groups. Okay, I have another Jeopardy question for you guys. Feminism. So Simone de Beauvoir in 1949, and I showed you her picture earlier on, published this work, often seen as the beginning of second wave feminism. What is the second sect? So de Beauvoir had written a book about essentially exploring feminism from firstly a biological perspective and understanding how biology had been used to kind of ensnare women and keep them kind of subordinate in various societies throughout human history. Very much an important feminist thinker. Second wave feminism, of course, marks a separation from first wave feminism, which is more about basic civil rights and civic equality. The Beauvoir's Second Sex was kind of a deeper reflection on what it meant to be a woman, understanding gender roles and how women could be kept subservient even in a society where nominally they had full legal equality. And France, actually, I should stress, had finally introduced votes for women under de Gaulle in 1944 after the liberation of France. So Simone de Beauvoir, another important intellectual in French society post-World War II, and actually probably in hindsight, her work is probably still more widely read than that of her long-term partner, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was still significant as well. Of course, for ordinary French people, the ideas of de Beauvoir, Sartre, Camus, etc. didn't really have much influence on their day-to-day life. Although what is interesting about French society after the Second World War was that finally we start to see the French birth rate rise again. So you see here in this chart, this demographic chart of France, that from the First World War, we obviously get a drop in the French population. It fell again during the Second World War. But immediately after the war, there's an enormous boom in the French population that people start having more and more children again, which French had become far less common in French society. Then, the birth rate had fallen going back to the late 19th century. And what's the mystery is why there was such a rise in population, given the fact that, the first couple of years after the Second World War, times were relatively tough still in France. But it seems to be an optimism created by the liberation that, France was on an upward curve, things are going to get better in France, and as a kind of sign of this confidence, people were willing to have larger families again. So this brought about a change in French culture as well. I mean, visitors to France commented how the kind of cafe culture of, couples who were married, who didn't have children, who were kind of spent a lot of their time outside socializing, engaging in nightlife, that kind of fell off a little bit as more and more couples began having kids and having a large number of kids in some cases. This last picture here, this is from the French Riviera in the early 1950s. I just wanted to show it as a way of showing that, okay, we have some cars here, but actually the French car business, so it's the early 1950s, and excuse my daughter babbling in the background, the French car business in the 1950s. So by 1951, despite the kind of idea of American movies kind of promoting a new materialism where people had cars, refrigerators, televisions, etc. That was still relatively rare in France. I think in 1950 the figure was there was one car for every 17 people, and by 1954 only about 8% of French people had a refrigerator or a washing machine. So I guess what I'm basically saying is that French people were watching more and more American movies and seeing this kind of lifestyle where machines essentially were making people's life easier, but that really wasn't reflected with the reality of what people were living in France in the early 1950s, although the economic recovery had begun. As we will see, France is going to eventually catch up and become one of the most advanced societies in the Western world.